Hi everybody, Matt back with you. 200 years ago, Todmorden was a very different place. The Industrial Revolution had just about come to an end. Todmorden was full of mills. It was the height of the fielding era. Yet amongst all this supposed work, a lot of people were not working and had no money. Each township, which included Todmorden, had their own poorhouses. So if a family had reached the financial dire straits and could no longer afford to live, they would be sent to these poorhouses where they would live and work there. Now the townships had given out relief payments, but in 1834 there was a new amended act to that poor law which set certain consequences here on my way up to Mankinholes in motion. So this amended act meant that the local townships to Todmorden, including Langfield, Stansfield, Errington, Wadsworth, Heptonstall and Walsden, must all come together to form what was going to be called the Todmorden Union, and each of those townships would put some money into a pot and they would build a big poorhouse, I would suggest probably here in Todmorden, for everybody to go to into one place. Of course, if you put people together who have different mindsets and different ideas, unity doesn't necessarily come easily. So the first meeting of the Todmorden Union was called in 1837 to be held here at the Golden Lion in Todmorden Centre. And at that meeting, Todmorden, Walsden and Langfield all said that they would refuse to comply with the orders that they'd been given and would not join with the union. They decided that they would raise their own taxes against those who could afford it to help pay for the poor, because they believed that this large poorhouse would end up being nothing more than a prison. So Todmorden and Walsden set up their own committee. They became known as the overseers of the people. On that committee was John Fielding. So Fielding supported and encouraged residents who were opposed to this amended act. He would organise petitions and boycotts, protest meetings, and Fielding even closed his own mills for 9 days in protest against the law. So the events that unfolded here in Mankinholes happened roughly November 23rd, 1838. It could be a day or two either side. I apologise if I haven't got the correct date. So Todmorden and Walsden had both been asked to pay £50 towards this poorhouse. Langfield had been asked to pay 20, as it was a smaller place. But they had refused, of course, because they decided they were going to support their own poor. So all three were eventually fined for insubordination. After all, it had been an act passed by law. But when they refused to pay the fine as well, it wasn't long till the long arm of the law appeared here in Mankinholes. Mankinholes today probably doesn't look too much different as it did back then. It feels like a place still lost in time. Definitely one of the oldest spots in Todmorden. Beautiful though. But the police arrived at this building. So the overseer of Langfield was Mr. William Ingham. He lived here in Mankinholes, what is now the youth hostel. And because he'd refused to pay the £20, he was actually then charged £5. And as he'd refused to pay that, the police turned up. Little did they know whilst they were inside, as they'd come to collect the goods with a horse and cart to take them away to pay for the fine, that outside quite a few people had got wind of the fact the police were here and had started gathering. So by now a great crowd had gathered outside Mr. Ingham's house. They'd smashed up the cart and sent the horses loose
and the officers, which were essentially bailiffs really rather than police, were inside trapped, and the mob outside ordering Ingham to send them out, or they would even burn the house down to get to them. So these officers, their future looked a bit bleak. Ingham came out and pleaded with the crowd not to kill the men. The crowd gave them the assurance that they wouldn't kill them as long as Ingham sent them out straight away. And even at this point, the mob had been throwing stones at the windows and smashing them. So Ingham had no choice. He sent the men out into the crowd. The crowd didn't kill them, but they stripped the two officers naked and chased them down into Shaw Wood, whooping and hollering after them, and all the way down into town. Quite an embarrassing experience, really. So the officers were heckled and jeered and chased naked down here through Shaw Wood, the crowd baying at their heels. They headed to a place called the Crown Inn, which at that particular moment in time just so happened to be where there was a meeting of the rest of the Todmorden Union. So when the crowd arrived there, you can guess what happened. The mob attacked the pub, smashing the windows. Those inside holding the meeting fled out of the back door. The two officers managed to get some clothes back on and managed to get some transport back to Halifax. This all happened before 8 o'clock in the evening. Seemed like a bad day, didn't it? Todmorden had no idea what was going to hit it the next day. So the next day, 26th of November, 1838, once again large crowds had gathered here outside William Ingham's house. The reason being they suspected that a good number of officers were on their way, alongside the military, coming to seize Ingham's goods and property. When the crowd realised that the officers were not going to appear at Ingham's house, well, they were a large crowd ready to riot. So what's the best thing to do? Head into town, cause some mayhem. So the rioters came up through Dewell's Gate, or Devil's Gate, up Backup Road to here, to Frith's Mill. Next to Frith's Mill is Frith's house, which was the house of Mr. Helliwell, another supporter of the Poor Act. The rioters broke in. The Helliwells were actually having a party. All the guests fled in a panic. Unfortunately, Mrs. Helliwell tried to plead with the rioters, to not smash a special clock that she'd been given by her mother. To no avail. The mob then started to return to Todmorden Centre, that they called here a Watty Hole, and ransacked all these houses here too. The mob came as far up as here at Backup Road to this place called Stoneswood. This was the house of one Mr. Abraham Ormerod, another supporter of the Poor. Through that they ransacked the house, kicked in the doors, and then set off back down the road. So at the bottom of Backup Road, at Gawk's home, this building behind me here is what would have actually been the poorhouse that people of Todmorden were paying to upkeep and look after the people here. So obviously the plan was to create a much bigger workhouse for all the parishes to put all their poor people in, but this was actually the location of the original workhouse in Todmorden. So as the mob re-entered Todmorden Centre, they reached the shop of one Anne Holt, smashed up the windows there. They then entered the surgery of Mr. Oliver, and threw some of the goods from his shop out into the street. They then turned their attention to Todmorden Hall. At Todmorden Hall, the mob surrounded. They smashed every single window of the building, and then entered the building through the dining room. When they were inside, they slashed at all the portraits, and even got the furniture together and started to set it on fire. Once they got them out of the house though, shovels and things were thrown through the dining room and the library windows. To be fair, there wasn't much left here. Next up was the home of Mr. James Suthers of Toad Lane. I'm not too sure which street Toad Lane was. I can't find it today. But he just so happened to be the rate collector. So you can guess what happened to his house. Next was the residence of Mr. Greenwood of Hare Hill House, where once again the items were smashed, but they also set fire to the house. It was only saved by the neighbours coming in and putting the flames out. So the last shop that the rioters reached was a shoemaker's in the centre of Todmorden, which also had its windows and doors smashed. But at this point, Mr. Robinson, who was one of the overseers, had turned up to speak to the mob, and he actually persuaded them to go home, because basically smashing up buildings was perhaps not in the best interests. They would have to eventually pay it back. They respected the man, so they followed his advice and went home. So by 7:30 it was all over, the riots had finished. However, that didn't stop the Burnley Light Dragoons from marching into town, and later the cavalry coming into town, but there was nothing for them to do when they arrived. They found a nice peaceful spot. So the mob was reportedly made up of mostly factory workers. So Halifax police came and entered the mills of Todmorden, specifically those owned by John Fielding, and a number of arrests were made. Fielding wasn't happy about this and actually offered bail to all those that had been arrested, but this was refused, and in the end only 17 men were actually sent to York for trial, even though at one point the report was that potentially 500 people were part of the mob. Fielding himself was also under suspicion, but with nobody actually going to support their investigation, and nobody would say anything bad against John Fielding. That case was also dropped. And actually in the end, only one person actually ended up imprisoned. And soon the idea of building this workhouse, by about 1840, that idea had been dropped altogether. So in actual fact, you could say that the riots had their effect, and so life continued as normal. These smaller poorhouses, like the one at Corksholm, there was one at Stansfield, and one in Wadsworth, they were continued as the poorhouses for the area. So yeah, it's an interesting bit of history of Todmorden. Not a lot of places remain today, certainly as they were nearly 200 years ago. But it is good that I think the right side won on this occasion. Let me know what you think. So this has been a bit of a talky video, a bit different, but it is a quite important piece of Todmorden's history. We'll see you soon. Take care.